My brother stole my inheritance while I was paying his bills, so I cut him off completely and took control of everything he thought he owned. I'm a 28-year-old guy, and I've always been the responsible one in my family. Growing up, our house wasn't anything special, just a small, two-bedroom apartment where my parents worked their fingers to the bone and still barely had time to notice me. My dad was always gone before sunrise and back long after dinner, his hands calloused from construction work. My mom juggled cleaning, laundry, and night shifts at the diner. They loved us in their own way, I guess, but love was measured in how well you followed the rules, not in hugs or praise. Then there was Jake, my younger brother. Jake could charm a stranger in seconds, and somehow everyone just let him get away with things. He had this reckless streak that made me anxious from the start, borrowing money he didn't have, skipping classes, flirting with trouble like it was a hobby. And every time he got caught, every time a bill went unpaid, I was there. "I've got it, Jake. Don't worry about it," I'd say, sliding my card across the table or writing a check I couldn't really afford. I'd stay up late counting envelopes, making sure rent, utilities, and even his credit card bills were covered because I couldn't stand the thought of him crashing completely. It wasn't that I minded helping Amitwa's family. After all, but there was always this gnawing feeling. A little voice in the back of my head whispering that he didn't appreciate it, that maybe he thought it was all just his right. But I shoved it down, telling myself that loyalty mattered more than resentment. I'd learned early that fairness sometimes meant being taken advantage of. Still, even as I bailed him out yet again one Friday night, while he laughed off his latest mistake, I couldn't shake it. How long could this go on before it broke me? Things changed the day I inherited money from my late aunt. It wasn't life-changing, but it was enough to finally breathe a little, pay off some debt. Maybe save for a condo. Finally feel like I had some control over my life. I didn't expect Jake to notice at first, but of course he did. That same night, over cheap pizza in the living room, he leaned back on the couch with that infuriating smirk and said, "So, you finally have some cash, huh? Mind if I, get a little help?" I felt that familiar pull in my chest. Part of me wanted to say no, to finally let him deal with his messes. But the guilt hit me before the words could form. "Look, Jake, I can help you out, but this is it, all right? Just for this month," I said, sliding my bank info across the table. He nodded like I'd just handed him a crown. And just like that, the line between generosity and exploitation started blurring. He began talking about plans, buying a new laptop for work, paying off some old debts, even casually mentioning taking a short trip with friends. I rationalized it, telling myself, I can afford it, it's family. I'll help him get on his feet. But even as I covered one bill after another, I started noticing the little things. A missing receipt here, a vague explanation there. He never said thanks, not genuinely. Still, I smiled, played the role of the supportive older brother, and tried to ignore the small knots of doubt forming in my chest. But every time I handed over money, every time I stayed up late figuring out how to cover both our lives, I felt at the creeping frustration that maybe this wasn't gratitude. Maybe it was expectation. And yet I kept going. Because what kind of brother would I be if I didn't? That night, as I closed my laptop after transferring yet another sum, I caught a glimpse of Jake laughing on his phone. And for the first time I realized he wasn't just taking my money. He was taking for granted the part of me that always believed in him. It hit me slowly at first, how everyone seemed to overlook the sacrifices I'd made. How Jake could do no wrong in the eyes of our family. Even our parents, who had once praised me for paying my own way and helping around the house, now brushed off my frustration. "Jake's just having fun. Don't be so hard on him," my mom would say, glancing at him with this proud, indulgent smile. And I, as always, swallowed my resentment. I had to keep the peace, didn't I? Family meant keeping the smiles, no matter how hollow. Jake, on the other hand, seemed to grow bolder by the week. He'd casually mention purchases he'd made with my money, laugh off late payments, or brag about going out with friends while I was quietly juggling bills and spreadsheets. One night, as I sorted our shared expenses on my laptop, he leaned over my shoulder, smirking. "Relax, man. You've got money now, you should enjoy it too. Don't get all stressed over numbers. It wasn't just the money anymore, it was the audacity. The absolute lack of recognition for the sleepless nights, the skipped meals, the late evenings making sure everything ran smoothly while he did whatever he wanted. I started to notice patterns, small lies, little half-truths, all feeding into his narrative that he was owed, that I was just a banker for his whims. And the worst part? Family laughed along with him. A joke here, a wink there. They never saw the quiet weight I carried. I began to feel invisible, like my sense of responsibility was a burden only I should carry. That night, as I counted the remaining funds from my inheritance, a chilling thought crept in. What if this generosity, this constant bailout routine, had trained him to take everything I gave for granted? What if I'd handed him more than money? I'd handed him power over me, over my patience, over my sense of fairness. And for the first time, I felt it a flicker of dread. Something in me whispered that this wasn't going to end well. It all came to a head the night. I agreed to cover Jake's big emergency. He called me frantic, voice shaking, claiming that his car had broken down in the middle of nowhere. "I don't know what I'd do without you, man," he said, breathless. I didn't hesitate. I transferred the money immediately, arranging a tow and some quick repairs, all while muttering under my breath about how this was becoming a pattern. But that night, as I sat at my kitchen table reviewing bank statements, something felt off. The numbers didn't add up. That so-called emergency? The repairs were nowhere near what he'd claimed. A few clicks later, I realized he had already spent a chunk of the inheritance on what exactly? New clothes, a gaming console, tickets to some concert I didn't even recognize. I confronted him the next morning. "Jake, the car, the money, it's way over what the repair costs. Where did the rest go?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He shrugged, leaning against the doorway with that smug smile. "Chill, man. I needed a few things, you know? Don't make it a big deal." It hit me like a punch. The casual tone, the dismissive smirk tit, wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. And as I watched him walk out, laughing on his phone like nothing had happened, I felt the first real surge of anger. My trust had been twisted into entitlement, my generosity used against me. Even worse, I realized how easily I'd let it happen. I'd ignored the little signs, the vague excuses, the missing receipts. I'd justified his behavior for years under the guise of family loyalty. And now, staring at my dwindling bank balance, I understood. I wasn't just supporting him financially. I was enabling him, teaching him that boundaries didn't exist that night. I paced my apartment, heart racing, thinking about how long this had gone on. The weight of betrayal was heavy, but so was the realization that I could no longer ignore it. Something had to change. And yet, as I heard my phone buzz with another message from him, I felt the sense that this confrontation was only the beginning of something much bigger. It was supposed to be just another routine check on my finances. But that Friday afternoon, I stumbled onto something that made my blood run cold. I logged into my online account to reconcile a few bills. And there it was, an unauthorized transfer, a large chunk of my inheritance gone. My stomach sank. I stared at the screen, heart hammering. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mistake he could laugh off this time. I confronted Jake immediately. "What the hell is this? Did you transfer money from my account?" My voice cracked between anger and disbelief. He leaned back on the couch, arms crossed, and grinned like I was overreacting. "Relax, bro. You've got plenty. I just moved some funds around." Chill out. Moved some funds around. That casual phrase made me see red. My jaw tightened as I realized he had been systematically siphoning off my inheritance, using my own trust against me. The betrayal wasn't just financial, it was personal. He'd spent months building this illusion of dependency, of me being the kind, supportive brother, and all along he was carving out my future for himself. I felt my chest tighten, my mind spinning. I'd always been patient, always been the responsible one. I'd covered his bills, helped him out of trouble, and yet he had treated my generosity like currency to be spent at his whim. The anger was almost physical, but it wasn't just anger, it was clarity. I realized that generosity alone wouldn't protect someone like him. If I didn't act, he'd keep taking, keep lying, keep pretending that I owed him everything. And worst of all, our family wouldn't see it. They'd still cheer for the charming younger brother while I bore the weight of his recklessness. That night, I sat in my empty apartment, the glow of my laptop harsh against the walls, staring at the numbers and making plans. I couldn't let this continue. I had to take control, reclaim what was mine, and show him finally that his games wouldn't work anymore. But as I closed the screen, I heard a familiar ding a message from Jake. Playful, casual, unaware that the storm was about to hit. And I knew it. Everything was about to change. The next week was hell. Every interaction with Jake felt like walking on a tightrope over a pit of fire. I tried to confront him calmly, laying out the evidence, showing him the transfers, the bills he'd ignored, the funds he'd siphoned off. Jake, this has to stop. You're stealing from me. You can't keep doing this, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a sheepish chuckle. This was the laugh of someone who knew he'd won. Oh, come on, man. You've got plenty. You're just overreacting. Can't you just let it slide this once? His grin made my blood boil. The audacity, the arrogance. What hurt the most wasn't just the money, it was how everyone else treated it like a joke. My parents shrugged when I brought it up. He's just young. You'll understand one day, my mom said, shaking her head as if I were the problem. My dad didn't even look up from his phone. And Jake. He soaked it all in, growing bolder by the hour. That week, I started documenting everything. Every payment, every transaction, every lie. I realized this wasn't just a fight over money, it was a fight for my life, for my independence, for my self-respect. I began strategizing, quietly planning how to regain control without giving him another inch. But while I was preparing my moves, Jake kept pushing boundaries. He flaunted his spending, bragged to friends about his freedom, and even mocked me behind my back. Each text, each casual dismissal, each laugh felt like a cut to my chest. And yet, beneath the frustration and anger, a small ember of satisfaction glowed. For the first time, I realized I wasn't helpless. I had the means, the knowledge, and the patience to take this back. I just had to wait for the right moment that night. As I heard Jake laughing on the couch, oblivious to the storm, I was quietly preparing. I knew one thing for certain. The next move was mine. I started moving quietly, almost like a shadow. Every remaining asset I had, I secured, transferring accounts, locking investments, making sure Jake couldn't touch a single cent he thought he could claim. I didn't say a word to him. Let him bask in his ignorance. Let him feel untouchable. The more he bragged about his freedom, the more I smiled behind the scenes. One afternoon, he leaned against my doorway, phone in hand, grinning like he owned the place. Hey man, any chance you can cover my rent again this month? You know, just until I get paid, he said casually, as if our last conversation had never happened. I looked at him, the calmest I'd felt in months. Not this time, Jake, I said, letting the words sink in. His grin faltered for a second, the first crack in his confident mask. He laughed nervously, trying to mask it. Come on, bro. Don't be like that. You've got more than enough. But I ignored him, walking past him to my laptop, checking the balance he'd assumed he could dip into. That's when it hit me. This was power. Real power. I could finally control what he thought he owned, what he assumed was his by right. I started noticing subtle changes immediately. Friends he'd bragged to started asking questions. Even some family members gave him that sideways glance, the kind that said, maybe he's not as clever as he thinks. And Jake. He was panicking, though he didn't know why yet. Sitting back that night, the apartment quiet except for the hum of the fridge, I realized something almost thrilling. For the first time in years, I wasn't just reacting, I was leading. I wasn't the one being taken advantage of. I was the one setting the rules, but the real test was coming. I could feel it in the air. Jake was smart, reckless, and desperate. 10 desperate people make mistakes. And when he did, I'd be ready. then it hit me harder than I ever expected. Jake didn't just panic quietly. He went on the offensive. That week I started hearing rumors friends he'd borrowed money from, family members he'd cornered, even casual acquaintances. Lies, manipulations, exaggerations, and somehow, some of them made their way back to me. Suddenly, it wasn't just about money anymore. It was about my reputation. It's my name, my integrity. One evening, my phone buzzed incessantly. Messages, calls, texts. "You're crazy, man. Stop being selfish. Why are you treating Jake like this?" The worst part? Half of them weren't even from Jake. They were from people who believed him without hearing my side. I felt my chest tighten, the familiar anxiety clawing back. My hands shook as I reread the texts, the words cutting deeper than any insult should. I called him, voice trembling but firm. "Jake, what are you doing? This is insane. You're spreading lies about me." He laughed on the other end, that infuriating mix of charm and cruelty. "Relax, bro. It's just people talking. You worry too much." And then, in that single sentence, I realized something terrifying. He didn't care about me at all. He never had. Everything, every debt, every favor, every bit of trust I'd given him had been a tool. That night, sat alone in the apartment, lights dim, staring at the ceiling. The panic, the betrayal, the isolation, it was crushing. I felt cornered, helpless, like the weight of years of sacrifice had finally collapsed on me. I'd been responsible, loyal, fair, and it hadn't mattered. Jake had used me, and everyone around me had turned a blind eye. I almost gave up. I almost let him win. My anger mixed with despair, threatening to consume me entirely. I had reached my rock bottom. But somewhere, buried under the exhaustion and the pain, a small, cold ember of determination sparked. I wasn't going to stay down. Not this time. And as I heard the faint click of my front door, I knew he was back and aware that this was the night everything would change. After hitting that low, I realized there was only one way forward. I had to be smarter than him. No more reactive bailing, no more emotional decisions. Every account I had, every asset, every remaining dollar, I secured it, mapped it out, and created layers of protection. I even quietly consulted a lawyer, explaining the situation without revealing too much, just enough to understand my options. I began laying traps, not to hurt Jake recklessly, but to reclaim what was mine, and finally set boundaries he couldn't cross. Jake, oblivious, continued with his usual antics. He flaunted spending, bragged to friends about his freedom, and made veiled digs at me online. Every casual brag, every careless slip, became a thread I could follow, evidence of entitlement he couldn't hide. And I did follow them meticulously, methodically. One evening he called me, voice brimming with confidence. "Hey man, I need a little help again. Can you cover this one?" I took a deep breath, feeling the calm clarity I hadn't felt in months. "No, Jake. Not this time," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. The pause on the other end was telling. I could almost hear him recalculating, realizing he'd underestimated me that night. As I reviewed my strategy, I started feeling a mix of exhilaration and vindication. For the first time, the tables were turning. He didn't even know it yet, but the power he assumed he had over me was slipping through his fingers. Every lie he told, every braggart move he made, was now a tool I could use not against him maliciously, but as proof of his recklessness, as evidence to finally reclaim control. And yet, beneath it all, a thread of suspense lingered. I knew Jake was clever, desperate, and unpredictable. One wrong move, one overlooked detail, and it could all blow up. But I was ready. The next move was Manand. I intended to make it count. The confrontation finally happened on a Saturday afternoon. I had everything lined up. Documents, bank statements, screenshots, a clear record of every bill he'd ignored, every transfer he'd made, every lie he'd told. I waited until he lounged on the couch, confident, laughing over something on his phone. Completely unaware that this time, "I held the power, Jake," I said, my voice steady but sharp. "We need to talk. Now." His smirk faltered. "Talk about what?" he asked, though I could see the tension creeping into his posture. I laid it all out. Every dollar he had siphoned, every lie he'd spun, every bill he'd ignored, and the evidence of his secret spending. "Do you see this?" I asked, letting the silence fill the room. "This isn't just about money. It's about trust. You've been taking advantage of me for years." He tried to laugh it off, as if humor could erase the mountain of proof in front of him. "Come on, man. It's not that bad. You worry too much." But I wasn't smiling this time. My tone was cold, precise. "It is that bad, Jake, and it stops today." The first time he looked unsure. The confidence, the charm, the smirk it cracked. I could see him calculating, wondering how this had slipped past him. I had every transaction, every text, every manipulated excuse cataloged. Nothing he said could undo it, and then I set the boundary. No more money, no more access, no more excuses. I reclaimed control of the inheritance, froze the accounts he assumed were his, and made it clear the privilege of taking from me was gone. That moment was intoxicating. For the first time in years, I felt the rush of empowerment, the clarity that comes from finally standing up for yourself. Jake floundered, desperately trying to explain, to charm, to manipulate, but it was too late. The tables had turned, and I was firmly in control. As he left the apartment that evening, defeated and silent, I realized something profound. I hadn't just reclaimed my money. I had reclaimed myself. After Jake left that day, the house felt different, quiet, almost foreign. I sat down at my desk, surrounded by the evidence I had collected, and for the first time I allowed myself to breathe. The weight of years of manipulation, of sleepless nights and constant worry began to lift. I had taken back what was mine, not through anger, not through revenge, through strategy, patience, and clarity. Word got around quickly. Friends and even some family members who had once shrugged at Jake's antics began asking questions. Noticing the cracks in the story he had spun, some came to me, quietly admitting they had doubted him all along, but hadn't known how to confront it. I realized that the truth had a way of surfacing. No matter how long someone tried to bury it, I started reflecting on everything, on the sacrifices I'd made, on the generosity I had offered, and on how easily it had been taken for granted. And while part of me felt anger at the betrayal, a larger part felt a quiet satisfaction. I hadn't stooped to lies or manipulation. I hadn't let bitterness dictate my actions. I had set boundaries, held firm, and reclaimed my life. Jake's arrogance, once so imposing, had crumbled under the weight of facts and accountability. I watched from a distance as he scrambled to rebuild his image, realizing too late that his charm and manipulation only worked so long that evening. I sat by the window, the city lights casting a warm glow across the room. I felt something I hadn't in years. Peace. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about dignity, respect, and control over my own life. I had learned that being responsible didn't mean being exploited, and being kind didn't mean being weak. And though I knew Jake would try to claw back somehow, somewhere I also knew this. I wasn't the same person who had let him take advantage. I was stronger, smarter, and finally free. By the time the week was over, I finally felt like myself again. Jake was still talking, still trying to salvage some sense of control, but it didn't touch me. I'd created boundaries he couldn't cross, and more importantly, I had rebuilt my own sense of security financially, emotionally, and mentally. Sitting in my apartment, the hum of the city below, I realized how much of my life I'd been giving away without realizing it. I reflected on all the times I had forgiven, covered, and excused him, thinking that family meant unconditional sacrifice. But family didn't mean being exploited. Loyalty didn't mean losing yourself. And generosity didn't mean letting someone else dictate your life. I had learned that the hard way, through sleepless nights, frustration, and heartbreak, but I had learned. The ironic part? Jake had thought he could manipulate me forever, charm me into submission with that reckless grin and casual excuses. But the very same traits that had once made him untouchable were now the tools of his undoing. Friends, neighbors, even some relatives who had silently observed everything began seeing the truth. Jake's illusions of control were falling apart while I quietly thrived. That night, I poured a glass of water, sat by the window, and let it all sink in. I didn't feel anger anymore. Not really. I didn't even feel triumph in a petty sense. What I felt was clarity. I had taken back my inheritance, yes, but more importantly, I had taken back myself. I had reclaimed my time, my peace, and my worth. And as I closed my laptop, I smiled at the thought that for once the responsible one, the one who had always carried the weight, was free. Free from manipulation, free from guilt, and free from someone who had never truly appreciated me. For the first time in years, I was in control, and nothing Jake could do would ever change that.